Welcome, V. It's wonderful to see you, and thanks for coming back to the Seekers Forum.
Thank you, Mark. I'm so happy to be here with you. The beginning of the year.
I know. Happy New Year.
Yeah.
So I'd like to start by talking about your new book. In the book, you say, you quote someone as saying something really interesting I'd like to sort of hit off with. You say, you have to be madly grandiose to write, to believe others would be truly interested in your thoughts. But it could also be that writing is survival, a way of cornering the mess, refusing to be swept away in another's tyranny, a cry in the dark. So
Yeah.
beautiful. Can you say something to me about how wounding makes the artist?
Well, I think, it's so funny because I think so much about the new book is both about reckoning with all kinds of things in a lot of different directions and a lot of different dimensions, but it's also about writing and 45 years of writing, and what does it mean to compile that and associate that and put that together into something. And what really hit me when I was doing it is that writing has been absolutely my survival. And some people talk about, I don't know who I would have been if I had not found writing at a very young age. It was the way, because I grew up in such a violent environment, and I was always under threat and under siege. There was no place to go. Like, it was madness. And that I discovered early on this other persona, this other voice, this other place where I could find myself and have a voice and have space and have imagination. It was everything. It was everything. And I think even now, I think living in this world, how do we make sense of it? How do we process it? How do we live with the utter precarity? How do we live with unknowing? And for me, it's creation. It's constantly creation. It's what do we make out of mess? What do we make out of not knowing? What do we create out of out of impossibility, right? And I just believe in art so deeply because I think it has that capacity, not necessarily to offer prescription even or solution even, but a way of sustaining ourselves and connecting and having discourse and asking the really important questions together, which is, I think, as good as it gets, particularly in 2023,
So how does wounding lead to originality, leads to the creative act?
Well, I think what wounding is it's sadly and blessedly opening up portals, opening up spaces that probably weren't meant to be there or weren't there originally. I think when you're wounded, a wound is an opening, right? It's an open sore, it's an open place. But I also think that experience has taught me that it's also the portal, and that wounds are portals. And that when I know as a young person, so much was happening to me violently and in a terrifying way early on, that I was beginning to see things and know things that other people weren't seeing, because some veil had been lifted, some protection had been lifted. And I remember I would have these night terrors where I was literally able to see into other realms and to know, like, parallel worlds that were happening simultaneously. And I think it's because I was so traumatized, to be honest, that those veils had frayed. They had fired up. They had gone away. And so it was, I know that the people who survive the trauma, if you find a way to survive, which I think creativity allows you, you can go very, very, very deeply into other realms if trauma has busted open those portals, and I think you get to see and know and feel what a lot of other people can't see and know and feel. And that's both a wonderful thing, and it's also a torturous thing, because you don't understand why everybody's not seeing what you're seeing, and why they won't see it when you're presenting it to them.
So finding your voice in that way is a matter of necessity. for someone
Absolutely.
with a
I don't
regular.
even know that I was, even thought about finding my voice. It was like, how do I write myself into existence? Because everything that was happening to me was annihilating. Everything that was happening to me was eviscerating my right to be here, my sense of worthiness of being here. So every time I wrote, it was almost like, all right, you're going to write yourself into existence. You're going to write yourself into beingness. And because I have a propensity to live on the edge of existential disappearance, where I can be made invisible easily because I was made invisible for such a long time. Writing has been this constant way of mattering, of being here, of putting a mark on the ground, of saying I exist, which was really hard to come by when I was younger. Yeah.
Did you always know you were an artist? Did you always feel like you were other, that you were an observer, a witness, someone whose job it was to report on what she was seeing?
I always knew two things: that I saw things because I was being told this constantly, that I was extreme, I was emotional, I was too intense, I was hysterical, that everything, I didn't have skin. I didn't have emotional skin. So that everything just came right in. And the other thing I knew is that I had to tell what was going on. I had to say the truth about what was going on. It was literally my survival. And I think if I saw somebody, I think Carl Bernstein said something really beautiful about the book. He said, I've been going to places and saying things people haven't wanted to see or go to my whole life. And I know that's true because I needed someone so desperately to do that for me. I needed someone to say, this is what's going on 157 Griffin Avenue. I know what's going on inside that house, and I'm going to call that out, and I'm going to nail that. And nobody did. And I think I made a promise to myself at a very young age that if I ever survived, I would go back and I would do that. Like I would be, I would say what's happening, because I think so often, like, we're living in this world where there is no reckoning, there is no accountability, there is no saying or seeing what is really going on. And I think it makes people mad. It makes people crazy. It makes people self-hating. It makes people not feel that gaslit and that anything in their lives haven't been real. And so the whole structure begins to be unwieldy,
Right. And that's the time we're living in now, where up is down and down is up. It's this Orwellian time when truth doesn't have the same value. So as a writer, how has your job changed in this moment of post-COVID, mid-disaster globally? How do you see how has it evolved for you? How is it different for you today?
Well, I think all of us writers are finding our way in these times where people are overloaded with information. People don't believe what they're seeing. People don't know what the truth is. They don't even know how to discern what the truth is. They don't trust their governments. They don't trust their media. They don't trust, and rightly so, right? All those forces have really abandoned people and let them down. And I think one of the reasons I wrote this book is that I think this country particularly is in the process, and it's happening whether we are trying to stop it or not, of a true spiritual political reckoning. It's happening. And there are forces that don't want that reckoning because they can't tolerate their own position in the history of that reckoning. They can't tolerate what the future will be if they have a reckoning. They're worried about their status. They're worried about, what will be found out about their families, what will be found out about them. But the truth of the matter is, if we don't have reckonings, the reckonings that are being called for, whether it's reckoning with what happened with white settlers who came and took this country away from the people, the indigenous who lived here, and destroyed their culture, created genocide, destroyed their traditions, robbed them of their lands, right? Followed by 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow and massive incarceration and the desecration of Black people in this country. Not to mention all the stuff that was happening to women and gay people and everybody else in the midst of all that, and Asian people, and like we can go on and on. The reckoning is restoration. It's the possible movement forward. And without the cleaning up of the past, like if I've learned anything about my body, for example, right, having had really bad cancer, what was cancer was that I had stored so much in my body of unexamined trauma, of unprocessed trauma, that it just began to create energetic clots, energetic masses of unwanted toxicity in my body that eventually grew into a tumor, right? And so much of what my work was in getting well was excavating and cleaning out and getting rid of and reckoning with what needed to be reckoned with so I could be well, right? And that happens on a personal level, and that happens on a political level, and that happens on a global level. And I think what we're seeing right now, I mean, COVID was such a time of reckoning, whether it was George Floyd, whether it was looking at this country, which in theory should be a country which could take care of all its people, and abandon everyone, like in the midst. I had no preparation, no care, no love, thousands of people dying, nurses wearing garbage bags, right, as uniforms, nobody being prepared, right? So we had that. We had George Floyd in those diabolical 9 minutes, which we witnessed of his air being completely cut off, right? And then we saw the fires that were just everywhere, destroying breath across the West, but also killing all the birds who couldn't breathe. So there was so much to reckon with. There was racism to reckon with. There was horrible climate change to reckon with. There was the failure of our infrastructure and our care and our medical system. And I had great faith that that was going to be the moment where we were all those of us who were privileged and didn't have frontline jobs, those of us who were privileged enough to be locked in would go in and would really begin to be accountable for our own past, for our own behavior, for the behavior of white people, for example. Like, who am I as a white person connected to the legacy of white people? And what do I have to change and transform in me? The same with who are we in this country, and what is our past, and what do we have to reckon with in order to change so that the future can be different? And I think there were many people who began to go in that direction. And I think there was a insane pushback. And I think this rise of white supremacy and fascism, this rise of the Trumpian mentality and insurrection, and was all people who were so scared to reckon with history and unwilling to reckon with history, because they would have to look at themselves and their families and their story inside that. And I think we're still here. I think we're in this, real struggle of, are we going to reckon with our past, or are we just going to self-destruct?
Is that why in the book you say that reckoning is the antidote to fascism?
Yes, I do, because
it's such a profound remark. Can you tell me more of what you mean by that?
Well, I think if we look at, it's so interesting because I'm looking at what's happening yesterday, for example, in Brazil, which is kind of this copycat insurrection that happened in the Congress, but no one was there. It's sort of a weird idea to occupy the Congress when no one's there. It was badly organized.
On Sunday.
But it obviously was mirroring what happened on January 6th and very close in dates, right? And it's this, it's what I see is what is fascism? It's the utter end of diversity. It's the other end of ambiguity. It's the end of it's one father, right? The patriarch, believing that they have the way, they know the answers, and it's the cleansing of anything that usually doesn't follow. In many cases, it's been white supremacist, it's been German, it's been Aryan, it's been and it's basically saying that there are no other people who have a right to exist but these. There's no immigrants, I mean, we can go down the list, but what it really is fear. It's fear. It's people who are terrified to address the story that they're living inside, which is often, if I think about this country, we are living in such a country where everybody on some level, except the very rich, are abandoned, right? Nobody is really taken care of here, right? It doesn't, and the idea that a lot of the people who are championing Trump, for example, believe that Trump is for them, when there is nothing about him that indicates that on any level. He has never cared about the poor. He's never cared about working people. He's never cared about anyone but himself. So the idea that this person, in the same way that Hitler was worshipped, like, did Hitler care about the Germans? He was sending them into mass murders, right? He was just sending them all to their deaths everywhere in the world. Did he care about the people? No, he didn't care about the people. He cared about his ego and sustaining his power and being dominant. And I think this worship of the fascists, this archetypal father Führer figure right now, it comes out of people's terror of being insecure, of not knowing their future, of living in precarity, of not knowing what's going to happen with the climate, what's going to happen with the pandemics, what's going to happen with nuclear war, how are we going to eat, how, I'm just reading articles today about the fact that a lot of the bees and the people who are pollinating, the pollinators are all dying off. So 500,000 people have already died because there's not enough fruit and vegetables. I mean, there are so many things around us right now that are making life so precarious. And I think rather than feel that, rather than die into our collective insecurity, which we could be feeling together and building our arcs where we make it nests for everybody on our ships and taking care of people on the ships that we're going to need to build to face the times that are coming, we're throwing everybody overboard, right? And I think this is the moment that we all have to find a way to look at what we're afraid of together, to address the fact that there is no savior, there is no one coming to rescue us, there is no father figure. The fathers have brought us here, the fathers have landed us right where we are, so we know they don't have very much to offer us anymore, and that we are in this together. And then how are we going to create the world that we dream of, even in the midst of all the terrible things that could be coming at us? That's what I'm interested in. How do we build the ark? And what does it look like,
I've known you a long time, and as long as I've known you, you've been burning with these questions. The world is kind of catching up to the level of intensity that I've experienced with you as your friend all these years. I want to talk to you about your own sense of conscience. Can you remember when that began to bud in you? When was the first time in your life that you were enraged over injustice, or when you felt the need to speak for the people without a voice?
Well, I think it began with my father. I think living with a fascist father, living with a tyrant, a person who determines everybody's opinion, determines everybody's food, determines everybody's clothes, determines your life, right? Where you don't have an opinion, where as a child you're there, children are meant to be, seen and not heard. And then to see my father's well, to be honest, his complete invasion and occupation of my body at a young age, and the injustice of that, the unfairness of that, the inequality of that, right? I was raging at a very young age about that. And then that extended into my father becoming very violent towards me and attempting, anytime I had an opinion, throwing me against a wall. Anytime I spoke back, I got punched. Anytime I existed, right, as a separate autonomous person. And I think I was so outraged by that at a young age. And I knew in my soul, like, I'd rather be dead. then, you know, I'm looking at these amazing women in Iran, for example, right, who are literally risking their lives every time they stand up. And I think I know where they are. I think you reach a point where your freedom is so obliterated and so taken away from you that you can't move or function or speak or live, that you don't care anymore. You're just like, kill me. I'd rather be dead. I'd rather have my opinion. And so I think I learned how to rebel in a way. I learned how to speak back because I had to speak back to my father, and no one in my family was speaking back to my father. And no one was saying that you can't do this. This is not how you treat people. This is not how you behave. And God knows why it was made like that. You know, we're all made differently and there's no judgment. Everybody's made the way they are. But I think that injustice was the first injustice. And then I began to see all kinds of injustice, whether they were injustice to Black people was really first thing that I think I was most aware of politically. You know, that it was during the civil rights movement, and it was that eruption and that clarity about what was happening in this country, and you know, the centuries of slavery that had unfolded into the 60s, and what were we going to do to make it right, and how were we going to stand up, and how were we going to be a part of that? And you know, and I think then obviously everything that happened around my understanding of women, when I came of consciousness and began to understand how incredibly oppressed and repressed and screwed over women were, and that we weren't entitled to our voice, and we weren't entitled to equal opportunities, and we weren't entitled to our desires. And if we felt sexual, we were sluts. When men got to be sexual, they were men. All those things began to be like, oh my God, this is a very unjust world, you know. And
so what have you seen the connection between being able to express oneself, like going into prisons, working with women, going to homeless shelters, working with women, giving women the opportunity to tell their stories? What's the connection between expression, healing, and developing a voice in the world and character in the world? Can you give me a sense of an early experience when you were working with a woman, that you had maybe a breakthrough with her, or saw something that showed you the power of that?
Well, what I think is, like, because I was so isolated, right? My only hope, I always had this fantasy that my family was this very exceptionally bad thing, and the rest of the world was going to be this amazing place, which if I got out of, and of course it didn't pan out to be that. I mean, the world turned out to be quite difficult. But what I realized is that when you're in solidarity with other people, when you're in connection with other people, when you're listening to other people's stories, and when you pay attention to other people, that's a profound healing for yourself, because you realize that you're part of one huge story that you're unfolding by listening, by speaking, by voicing, by hearing. It's all part of the same thing. And I think I remember when I first went to Bosnia, and it was so funny because I had some idea. I was going to rape camps where I was going to be listening to women's stories, and rather than me going and saying, I don't know this experience, I've never sat with women who have been in a rape camp in the middle of Europe in the 90s. I couldn't even imagine what that would feel like. And so I went with this idea that I was going to go and help, and I was going to have suggestions to offer, and I was going to be a playwright. And of course I got there, and within minutes, I was so out of my element. I had no business being there. It was so much bigger than me, and the feelings were so much more intense than, you know, I'd ever experienced. And I realized that my job wasn't to have answers. My job wasn't to like lead and guide. My job was to be present. My job was to listen. My job was to receive and be a person of compassion, and show up in the fullness of myself. And that was a radical shift for me. That was the beginning of me being to understand that what people want is, they don't want opinions. They don't want directions. They don't want you to rescue them. They don't want to be saved by you. They want you to listen to them. They want to be real. They want their suffering to matter to someone. And I think that's what this whole journey of my life has been, is like how to show up so that people know that their lives matter and that their suffering matters and what they've been through matters, and that somebody cares and somebody's listening and maybe someone's recording it, and so that they can hear it back and they can play. I remember when we were in when I worked in Bedford Hills Prison, and I was running that writing group with amazing women who were all incarcerated for violent crimes. It was an 8-year, 9-year group, and just to be in that room where women were struggling every week to write into their crimes, to write into why they had done those crimes, to write into taking responsibility for those crimes. It was such a sacred, holy experience. And when we finally, when they finally wrote their pieces and I edited them, I gave them to amazing actors to come and perform, so the women could hear their stories, played back to them, voiced back to them, so they could see that they mattered, so they could see that their experience had value to themselves, to a community, to other people. And that was so beautiful and profound. And I think we sometimes make it so complicated, but really what most people need is to be heard, is to know that what happened to them matters,
What another thing we need is an apology, and that's something you've written about. You wrote a book called The Apology, and it feels like it's in the air very much, along with reckoning, the sense that we need to have accountability, we need to have apology. And what is the difference between a sincere apology that heals and lip service of "I'm sorry you feel that way"?
Yeah. Well, I say this a lot. I think that apology is probably one of the most profound and important practices, but nobody teaches it, right? We teach prayer, we teach meditation, but we don't teach apology. And it was funny, I was giving a talk at what's the name of the church on the Upper West Side? Oh God. Anyway, the big Riverside. And I was giving a talk on apology, and at the end, and I had quoted a few examples of apologies that had been given by states and at the end, these ministers said to me, "Why didn't you quote the Bible?" And I said, I really couldn't find anything in the Bible where people apologize. I heard writings on forgiveness, which I'm always a little wary of, because I think it's a little constructed, it's a little religious, it's a little blaming, like you will forgive, even though there's no reason for you to actually forgive because there's been no apology. And I think I would argue that there's an alchemy that occurs in an apology when somebody really goes through a deep 4-step process where they have reckoned and addressed and confronted what they've actually done. And I think that takes training. Like, when I wrote The Apology, which was a book I wrote where I wrote my father's apology towards me, for me, in his words that I needed to hear, it was an excruciating process because I had to climb into my father and actually feel who he was, why he had done what he had done, what in his own background, what in his family, what in the culture, what in the politics of his makeup had made him a man who was capable of incesting and beating and almost murdering his own daughter. And to climb into my father, to try to understand who he was so profound for me. But it was also profound for him as the spirit who had come, this ancestral spirit that had come into my consciousness during that time. And I realized that it is very, very hard to encounter all the things you need to encounter in an apology. Like, A, who are you? What made you? Who created you that you could be somebody to do that? B, what did you actually do? Like, what are the details, the exact details, like blow by blow accounting of what you did? Because unless you do that, it's not a real apology. And then what were the impacts of what you did, the short-term, long-term impacts on the person you did it to really deeply reflect on how you have harmed persons in a way that has impacted their entire life, and to feel that and to know that in your body, and then to make an apology. I think if we were doing that, if we had groups, if we had places, if we had spaces where men, where white people, where, you just name it, where people who have committed acts of horror and neglect and had spaces to sit and work with other people, to go inside and really address that. I mean, I just imagine the karmic releases, the karmic letting goes that would begin to happen in the microbial religious or spiritual cosmos, right? There is so much clogged karmic tar. It's just tar. It's like thick with tar. And every time one of us is willing to go in and really address and really look at the pain we have caused in other people and why we've caused it and what in our makeup made that happen that we can change, the world gets cleaner and freer and more able to create a future that is viable. And we don't have pathways for that. We don't have institutions or centers or spiritual practices that really get people to engage in apology as a formal, real practice of transformation.
Because there's so much shame.
Much shame.
Getting
So
through
much
the
shame.
tar of shame, that buildup of shame/grief and denial is almost impenetrable.
And the saddest part about it is, like, we are all faulty. We are all mistakeful. We are all people who are in the process of figuring out who we are, and we've all made horrible mistakes. And the system in this country, this horrific prison system, which just throws people away and hard matters them for life, like you are your mistake permanently forever and ever, and gives them no tools, gives them no process to transform those mistakes. So they're just fixed in that mistake forever, rather than saying, okay, I spent years listening to women in prison, and most women who got to prison never felt like they had a choice a day in their life. The world just was rolling them over, whether it was poverty or abuse or neglect. It was just rolling them, rolling until one day they did something terrible and they ended up in prison. And prison was really the first place they ever began to encounter choice, right? And instead of saying, okay, we have landed here with this horrible mistake, this horrible act we have done, can we reverse and try to go back and say, what were the steps that led us here? So that we can be led out, so we can be freed, so that we can change, so we can transform. We have a very punishing world that we live in America. It's punishment and guns, and it's destroying us. It's destroying us.
Yeah, it's true. A couple of more questions. I just want to ask you about going over all of this work, 45 years of writing for the book. What patterns, what surprised you in your work? What patterns, what motifs, what sort of evolution? When you read your early work, what do you see now?
That's a good question. I think I was insanely idealistic. I was even though I was very cynical at the same time. I mean, it was kind of this weird cross, but I think I did not understand how deeply afraid people are of confronting the truth. I did not understand that. And so that's one thing. I think I was shocked to see how much my mother figured into everything that I was writing about, because I always thought like I was disassociated from her, but she just seems to have woven herself into, and I have to say my concerns have always been the same. It's this desire to live in a world where women are not constantly, and gay people and trans people and non-binary people and Black people and Asian people, all marginalized people are all people who have been pushed to the margins, shall we say, but they're not marginalized, but they've been pushed there. Like, how do we create a world where violence isn't this ongoing threat, whether it's the killing of trans women, whether it's the cutting of a young girl's clitoris, whether it's there's just violence, police brutality towards Black people, always there, always present. And so many people are living under this constant threat of potential violence, right? Potential violence. And I think how that has shaped us, how that has determined us, what would we be like if we were free, if we were safe, if we lived in ongoing safety and we could spread our wings and we could express ourselves sexually and we could be fully and potently alive and creative and connected. I mean, to me, I've been obsessed with that since day one. And so it's kind of interesting to look back and go, oh my God, we're still here, pounding the same story.
And let me just ask you about V, your name V. You say that in the book that it's your freedom name. You say it's the name of your real people and the reminder of your true origins. Can you say something about why you changed your name, what it means to you, why Eve wasn't working for you anymore?
Mm-hmm. Well, after I finished the apology, it was really kind of amazing because the last line of that book is "Old man, be gone." And I don't know who wrote it, my father or I, but when I wrote it, it was like the end of Peter Pan when Tinkerbell just goes shh, my father just went shh, right? He just disappeared and he hasn't been back. And it was really amazing because I realized I have no rancor towards him anymore. I have no bitterness. I'm not in his story anymore. I'm not in his narrative. I'm not his victim. I don't want to prove anything to him. I have nothing to show him. My whole life was like, I'm going to show you. That's over. That's over. And I realized that I really believe in names. I think names are really significant. I think they determine a lot. And I realized that I couldn't have his name, that he wasn't for me. He wasn't about me becoming who I was supposed to be. He was about annihilating me. And I knew I couldn't have the name Eve anymore because that's the name he gave me. And I knew I couldn't have his last name because I didn't want his last name. And I just started thinking about, well, everything about my life that's been beautiful has had to do with V's. I love the letter V. It's such a beautiful opening. It's an invitation, right? It's a reaching up so that it can be met by the divines reaching down. It feels like voluptuous and victorious and vulva-ish, and it feels like it's a letter and soon I'll be nothing. We're down to a letter and soon I'll be nothing. And it feels so good to be V. I since like really imagined who my people are, which is the last epilogue of the book, like the people of V who I come from, and they're really beautiful people. And I want to be living in the world of V, which is not the world of domination and hierarchy. And it's a world of cooperation. It's a world of care. It's a world of connection. It's a world of working on every bit of yourself so that what you're doing in every gesture that you do is putting out love, creating love, making the world better, making people feel better, making people feel welcome, making people feel included, making people feel bigger than they've ever seen themselves so they can grow into that idea of their bigness. And really doing that unashamedly. I say in that epilogue, and I think about this a lot, that when I was younger, when I was a child, I loved everyone. I loved everyone. I would just walk around and like people with big, fabulous hair. I remember Candace Levitt's mother had big red hair and lots of makeup, and I thought she was amazing, right? And of course, my mother was like, oh, she's gauche, and and I remember thinking, how could you call her anything but amazing? She's like a work of art, and I remember loving people, and I would come home and I was like, I met this amazing person, and I was told, you cannot love everyone. that is an indication that you have no discernment, that you're cheap, that and I thought to myself, when I grew up, what an absurd thing to tell a child, that you cannot love everyone. Like, it's an indication that something's wrong with you. And so I think for me, what it means to be V is that I am working to get to a place where I do in fact love everyone. And that doesn't mean I like everyone. It doesn't mean I like everybody's behavior and how they are, but where we hold the possibility for the evolution and the transformation of every human being to become beautiful, to become loving, to become light, that is there, and that we know that things were done to people and things happen to people that change them. And nobody's born a serial killer. Nobody's born a rapist. People are born into this world and things happen to them, and they are traumatized and they are hurt and they are raped and they are beaten and they are put down and they are left out and they are excluded and they are made to feel less than. And those distortions begin to create more distortions inside people and those desecrations. And so I just feel like every time I say V, it's a reminder to me of who I want to be, of who I want to be. I don't want to be Eve, the fallen one in the garden, who ate the apple and who got banished forever into the darkness and was responsible for sin, the downfall of the world.
Thank you so much, my dear. This has been really fantastic.
Oh, wonderful to talk to you, Mark, as always.
Thank you, my darling. I'll see you very soon.
Okay. Bye, honey.